this computer, and we are ready to go. We are in session 2, and we're going to be looking at the Old Testament tonight. And as we look at how we got the Old Testament, a couple things to remember. One is there were no printing presses back in the day. The printing press didn't happen until near 1500 AD. And so everything that we have of the Old Testament was something that was handwritten and copied. Another thing to remember is that we don't have any of the original documents of the Old or the New. There are no originals left. And honestly, I think that was God's divine plan, because knowing the fallen human condition, if we had the original documents, we'd set a shrine up and we'd put that up on a pedestal and we'd treat that as something sacred, an artifact, and we would take our eyes off of the Lord and instead put it on that artifact. So I think that's a part of the reason why we don't have the original documents, kind of like a Holy Grail or a shroud or anything like that. We don't have any of that stuff. Regardless of the legends that you hear, they're all up in dispute. We don't know any of it is authentic. None of it's been authenticated. So, and I think that's by design. So understanding those things, it's important for us to kind of go back and see how the Old Testament came to be and what we have as the original documents, the oldest and earliest documents. And you'll see that as we talk about this, that as recently as 150 years ago, the authenticity of the Old Testament was really in question. And it was in question among a lot of Protestant denominations. A lot of German theology tended to downplay the authenticity of the Old Testament, but there were some archaeological findings and discoveries that began to turn around and authenticate what we already had. So we're going to kind of go back now and look at what we have in the Old Testament. And so I'm going to go ahead and get the screen shared, and we'll get going with this. Pulling that up, which would have been nice. I should have had this up. This would have been my first slide. So it's still my first slide. So we're talking about this. We're talking about the Old Testament reliability. And so the first thing we need to consider, and what you have in front of you as an Old Testament, is the original document is what's called the Masoretic Text. And the Masoretic Text is essentially the entire Old Testament. And it's comprised of and made up of two major documents. One is more recent and one is more complete. And so the one that is more recent is what is called the Aleppo Codex. The Aleppo Codex. It's the oldest one. It's the oldest Hebrew Bible. It dates back to 930 AD. So think about that for just a moment. If Malachi wrote the last book of the Bible in 400 BC, you have about a 1500-year gap between Malachi's writing and the Aleppo Codex, which was written at about AD 930. It was, the reason it's called the Aleppo Codex is because for 500 years it was housed in Aleppo, Syria. As you look in your book, you can see that it was considered by most to be the most authoritative copy of the Hebrew Bible. It's very comprehensive, and again, it's the oldest. It's unique in that as you're looking in your book, it features vowel markings and marginal notation. Now, why is that significant? I don't know if you remember when the Dead Sea Scrolls came through town, and they were down at the museum down at Balboa Park.
Yeah, I went there. Yeah.
Anybody else go there besides Jack? Anybody get a chance to go see those? Well, what you notice with Hebrew language, and maybe you've seen it even. Hebrew language is unique in that what you see as the primary letters are all consonants. There are no vowels in the Hebrew language. They're all consonants. And it wasn't until the Masoretic Text, the Masoretes came along, that you began to see vowel markings. And so what they would do is that they would pronounce it based on the consonants and based on what the letters were called and what they were titled. And so as they did that, they would assume a vowel sounding. So they made vowel soundings, and so they put those there. They put the marginal notations there. As you see, it was in Syria, in Aleppo, for up until sometime in the second half of the 15th century. And so it showed up there. That's where that was housed, and it stayed there until the 20th century. Until and the specific watershed event that caused the Aleppo Codex to get moved was 1947, when the United Nations recognized Israel as a sovereign state, and they created an independent Arab state as well in Palestine. And if you've read any of that recent history, that whole area blew up. It was embroiled in war, been embroiled in war ever since. And so, true to form, riots broke out in Aleppo. The Aleppo Codex, part of it was destroyed, and so it had to get smuggled out of Syria, and it was brought to Israel, and now in 1957, and now it's kept at a shrine in the Israel Museum, and you can see it's there at the Shrine of the Book. And so that's where the Aleppo Codex is. So you go to next time you're in Israel, you take your trip, go to the Israel Museum. You can see the Aleppo Codex, and that is the earliest, well, one of the earliest documents, complete documents of the Old Testament that we have. But you can see the problem of the 1,500-year gap between Malachi and this codex, can't you? That's problematic. And so how do we know that the Old Testament truly is what the original writers wrote? So that continued to be a problem. That continued to be an area of debate. So the second major text was what was called the Leningrad Codex. The Leningrad Codex, and the reason it's called the Leningrad Codex is because it was in what was known as Leningrad. But now that's, since the Soviet Union fell, it's now St. Petersburg, and that's where it is today. It's the oldest complete Hebrew Bible that's still preserved. It's considered one of the best examples of the Masoretic Text. And notice it was written even later. It was written around 1010 AD. So it's a little younger, not quite as recent as the Aleppo Codex, and it was, from what people can estimate, it seems to have been written in Cairo, sold to someone that was living in Damascus, but then ultimately moved to Leningrad, and ultimately now in the Russian National Library in St. Petersburg, Russia. But once Leningrad fell, they still called the text the Leningrad Codex, and so, and you can see the reason for that was to avoid confusion. You can look at that and look at what we have now with the modern Hebrew Old Testament, and you can see that there's still a lot of accuracy there, but the bigger problem was you had a lot of textual scholars that 100 years ago, 150 years ago, and even now, with a lot of different denominations and Protestant groups, they question the authenticity of what we have as the Old Testament. And so, again, if you hold to absolute inerrancy, you don't have any problem with this. But if you start to peel it back, like we talked about last week, another form of inerrancy, you're going to cite this discrepancy is one of the problems. You know, this was one of the things that they did. So look at that last statement there about the Leningrad Codex. The Bible Manuscript Society put it this way: the Leningrad Codex provides irrefutable proof that the Hebrew Old Testament has remained unchanged down through more than 1,000 years, copied faithfully from manuscripts 1,000 years earlier. Okay, and again, you know, that's a valid point, but again, scholars would have a problem going on the other side of that 1,000 years. How do we know that that was originally what was transcribed? So we have to keep going with this. Going further in our book, as we talk about the Manuscript Society, we're going to talk about how the Old Testament was transcribed. And as you can see in your book, the scripture really doesn't give us a clear idea when the books were all assembled. You know, we've got a gap in between Malachi and the Aleppo Codex, 1,500 years. When did all this get compiled? What we do know is that we can look at many of the canons when the books were weeded out and they were identified, determined which ones were legitimate books, which ones weren't, or canonization. You can go back and look at your book for that. You can see that. Okay, this is where I need a co-host. Hang on a second. I'm letting somebody in, whoever 1857 is. All right, back to it. You look in what they're seeing, you can see that the Old Testament canon was closed earlier than 200 BC. They believed, and typically what the Old Testament was transcribed as, it wasn't always written, but there was a lot of oral tradition. And the way that would work would be you would have somebody stand in front of a group of scribes, and they would read the document out loud. So they would read the document, everybody else would copy it down. So they'd do dictation. And so you'd have that copy, they would be double checked and triple checked. There were all sorts of checks and balances in place to preserve that. So they would do that in order to preserve that written tradition. But up to that point, there was a lot of oral tradition. And so as we look at this, let's see, I want to make sure I'm up to date here. All right. You can see the scriptures were important to the nation of Israel. A special class of scholars called Sopharim developed during the Second Temple period. Everybody know what the Second Temple period was? If Solomon was the first temple, the Second Temple was, does anybody remember their history? Remember Judah, the nation of Judah got taken out of Judah, Jerusalem. They went to Babylon for 70 years. Remember, they had their 70-year timeout. And when they came back, remember, that's when they built the Second Temple. Okay, and that was built during Ezra.
Ezra.
Okay, when you read the book of Ezra, you'll see that Second Temple period. Well, during that time, you had this group of scholars called the Sopharim. And so from about 500 BC to 100 AD, or the blanks you fill in, the task of the Sopharim was to preserve the sacred traditions as well as the manuscripts. So they were writing down the traditions. They were writing down the things that they would do as part of Hebrew customs and Jewish customs. So they were taking care of that in addition to preserving the scriptural documents. Okay, these scholars later believed that these Jewish men, the Sopharim, were possibly of priestly descent, since Sophar, as most Sophar whose genealogy is known, they were priests. So these guys knew their Bibles, they knew their Old Testament, they knew their scripture, and as well as they knew the other traditions. So there were other traditions, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment. But they specialized in these things. They knew them. They knew them in their head. They could write them from memory. They were very well versed with this. So as they wrote that, The Sopherim were the ones who really did a lot of work to preserve what was in place after the Jews came back from Babylon. So these guys were busy compiling everything and digging out the artifacts and digging out the transcripts, pulling back the oral traditions of the people that remembered way back when. This is what we used to do back in Josiah's day, so on and so on. They pulled all this together and compiled it. And so they kept this in place. And so as a result, all of these, what I'll call them extra biblical manuscripts, were compiled, and it became known as the Talmud. Okay, the Talmud in the Jewish mind went side by side with the scriptures. And this was the problem the Pharisees had in Jesus' time, is that these traditions were written, but they weren't, they weren't scripture, but they came alongside scripture. But the Pharisees, Sadducees, they elevated this book to be the equivalent to scripture. And this is what Jesus always had to continue to challenge. He was always getting in their face. You guys tithe mint, you tithe cumin, you tithe all these things, but you neglect justice, you neglect righteousness. You can't do one and not the other. He would do things like that. But that stuff is what came out of the Talmud. So the Talmud was one who, it was a product. It was a result of the work of this group of scholars called the Sopherim. And they were in that era between 500 BC, 100 AD. So you can see the overlap into the New Testament. Okay, so the Talmud at that point was an important document then. Okay, the Sopherim then, as we go on, they were followed by a second group of scribes called the Tanaim. The Tanaim, which is a Hebrew word that means repeaters. And so what they did is they took the traditions, the writings of the Sopherim, and said, let's just keep doing what they're doing. And so they continued to do that for the next 100 years, 100 to 200 AD. Then from about 200 to 500 AD, you had another group of scribes called the Amoraim. Amoraim. And you pronounce it just the way it's spelled. Amoraim.
Yes.
What they were doing, they continued to preserve Hebrew text, not just the Talmud, but also at this point, they're starting to see, we need to preserve the prophets' writings. We need to preserve the Torah. We need to preserve the poetry books. We need to preserve all these things. So they're continuing on with that. So in that process of getting to where we have the Masoretic text, notice right now we've got three groups of scholars that have been busy between the time that the Jews came back from Babylon up until 500 AD. And they've been busy preserving, they've been busy transcribing, they've been busy copying down the documents that they had from previous generations. So they continue to make those copies. That's good news, but the bad news is there just weren't that many copies to have, because you have to do it all in longhand. It's pretty tedious work. Imagine if you had to copy by hand the entire book of Leviticus. And that's just one book. You got 39 more to go. And you have to copy them all down by hand, and you better be right, and you better not have any misspelled words, and you better not have these smudges on your document. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that we were facing.
How long would it take them to do that?
Oh, it took quite a while, and there were all sorts. Like I said, there were a number of checks and balances with that. So if you didn't use the right ink, or you smudged a letter and it didn't look like all the other documents, throw it out. So it was a real challenge, real problem. Debbie, see you right there. Good to see you. I got a question.
Yes, I was wondering where all this was in the notes. Are we following our notes? I'm trying to find it.
Yeah, it's on page 10, I think.
Session
What?
2?
I'm on session 2, yeah.
Okay. And
Page 11, I believe, but there's no page marks on
There's
this
no
thing.
pages.
Well,
Page
It
11?
doesn't show a page number.
something happened to my pages when I sent them to you then.
Because I've only got four pages for session. Oh, I see, page 11. Oh. I was just trying to kind of follow along, but I'm not seeing it. I'm sorry.
On my printout,
okay.
it's the third page of session 2.
Is it on the first page of session 2, did you say?
Third.
Third.
Yeah, the third page.
1, 2,
After
and 3.
session 2. Session 2.
Okay, thank you.
So if you see the sentence from 200 to 500 AD, a third group of scribes called
Yes, I
the
see that.
Amoraim began to preserve the Hebrew text.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, that's where we are right now. So at
Okay.
this point now, this is where these scholars, specifically the Amoraim, they started to come together and put these rules in place to preserve the Old Testament documents and to keep them preserved. And that's where they had things like they had to have a certain type of parchment. They would have to have a certain type of ink. They would have to use a certain type of writing instrument, whether it's a quill or something else. It had to have the right width of a nib. It had to have the right kind of ink, and you had to have the same kind of pressure as you transcribed each letter. And if any of them were not consistent, that whole document got thrown out. So this is the process that was taking place here. Jack, got a question? Go.
Yeah, would you consider these as being like scribes?
Yes. The same
okay.
thing as a scribe. You're just transcribing. That's the whole point of whole root of the word is scribe.
Okay.
Okay. Moving now to the 8th century. You can look at the 8th century AD. You come to these scribes now called the Masoretes. And when I was in seminary, my Hebrew professor, before we started translating Hebrew, he told the class every night before you go to bed, you thank God for the Masoretes, because they were the ones that put the vowel markings in this, in the Hebrew text. Otherwise, you just had a bunch of consonants. And so the vowels just gave you all sorts of clarity as to what the words meant. So the Masoretes were very diligent, and they really opened up a window of blessing for us later on. So these Masoretes at the 8th century AD, sorry, I got behind my slides here. The Masoretes diligently worked, and they put the text today in place that we know as the Masoretic Text. Okay, it's as I wrote here in the book, it's a very faithful text of the Hebrew Bible, yet it's not perfect. And these Masoretes understood the inherent possibility of human error when copying the Hebrew Bible. So they tried to combat the errors by adding all sorts of different notes. They tried to deal with those notes called Masorah in the margins to safeguard the text. So in that document, they would write over here, here's a document that says this word, here's a document that says this word, here's a document that says this word. And so if there were any discrepancies that they had to address or they had to make a decision on, they'd make the decision, and then over in the margin, they would put the different words that they had to choose from. And you'll actually find that in the New Testament with the Greek manuscripts as well. The scholars said, would tell you, okay, in some of these earlier manuscripts, we found this word, but in some of these later manuscripts, we found this word. This word was found in more manuscripts than others. And so they would give you that information. So the Masoretes were diligent in doing that. And again, all of this added to this notion that we can't really rely on the Old Testament. Okay, that's still all kind of floating around, isn't it? And so it doesn't sound like the Old Testament is that reliable. So again, we'll get to that in just a moment. What they found in the differences between the texts, they determined, the opinion that was correct, and then, as I mentioned, they related their decisions not just on verses and words, but even every single letter. And it's interesting, and it's important because in some of the Hebrew letters, there's some markings that are almost the size of a comma on some of these letters. And a comma on one of those letters, if it had it, it was a completely different Hebrew letter than another one. I mean, some of that was that. I wish I could write it here for you, and I guess I probably could. Let me see, just for fun, I might be able to do it in annotating. Here, I'm going to jump out of here for a moment, and I'm just going to write freehand. Okay, so for instance, this is one Hebrew letter.
Yeah, it works great.
Okay, that's one Hebrew letter, the Hebrew letter Het. Here's another Hebrew letter. See the difference?
Almost look identical.
They look identical.
Right.
But they're two different words. They're two different letters. So it's very interesting. So these people, the Masoretes, were very instrumental in that, in preserving that. So they looked at those kind of things. They looked at the letters. They looked at all those little marks to make sure that they were accurate, and they would tell you to that point. So we're very, the Masoretes contributed a whole lot. They also, because of this huge influx of documents, they had all sorts of these different manuscripts that they had to transcribe. They had to kind of put together a code of transcription. How do we do this to where we keep it uniform and preserve this for centuries on? Because what we're doing is going to have a long-term significance in the course of human history. So they saw that, and so they began to establish those kind of rules. And so we know these pronunciations of these different Hebrew words simply because they put in things like chanting symbols, they put in vowel placements, and these are all courtesy of the Masoretes. And so these came in all sorts of little dinky markings down at the bottom or at the top or in the middle of these letters, these Hebrew letters. And so the Masoretes did all this. And so reading further in your text here, from the Encyclopedia Britannica, if the Masoretes hadn't devised their systems of vowel notation, the most important Hebrew text would have been translated and possibly preserved, but the rest of it, as well as the Hebrew language at large, would have gone the way of the dodo bird, would have been gone, would have been extinct. But the Masoretes preserved it thanks to these chanting symbols and thanks to these vowels. We know how to speak it. We know what those words really meant. So, like my professor said, thank you, Lord, for the Masoretes. So that's where we are at this point. That's part of these the transcription history. Any questions or anything?
Yeah, would they have thrown some of these books out, would you say, like they did when they met later and went over all the books to decide which was actually the inspired word of God? When was it on Nissan when they met?
Well, it really wasn't so much you had a bunch of bogus books as much as, well, you had just manuscripts that had discrepancies. There were some of those books were apocryphal. And if you've heard of the series of books called the Apocrypha? Anybody heard of those? The Catholic Bible will keep the Apocrypha. They were not canonized, mainly because there wasn't the consistency with those books that the 66 books of the Bible that we have had. So the Apocrypha was kind of set aside with that. And then there's another group of books that was set aside as well called the Pseudepigrapha. And those were books that were written around this time, but they were pretty much written off as not being authentic or divinely inspired. Dave, I see your hand, sir.
So you mentioned the two, is it codices? What's the plural of codex?
Yeah, that's right.
Codices. So, but isn't it likely, or don't we have other scraps of manuscripts, just pieces here and there, like the Dead Sea Scrolls or others that they could also refer to now that they may not have had back in the day of the Masoretes?
Were you peeking ahead?
No, honestly, no.
We're about to get there. We're going to get there. I was trying to build the suspense, trying to create some tension. Oh my God, goodness, is the Old Testament reliable? Oh no, this doesn't sound right. You just popped the balloon.
Sorry about that.
It's all right. Spoiler alert. There's good news coming. All right, but we'll get there. We'll get there. So looking at the transmission standards, okay, everybody's looking at those. We're looking at a number of different things. We're looking at rabbinic rules, the writing materials, the preparation of the leather or the parchment. I mentioned this earlier. Error correction, transcribing of the divine names. And what do I mean by the transcribing of the divine names? What is that? If you look in your Old Testament, in many places, you will find the word Lord in capital letters.
Yeah.
Have you ever noticed that?
Yep.
Okay. Sometimes you see Lord in capital letters, and sometimes you'll see Lord in lowercase letters, but God in capital letters. Maybe you've seen that. That word that's in capital letters is the Hebrew word Yahweh, YHWH. And to the Jew and to the Masoretes and to those scribes before them, the word Yahweh was so holy and sacred it could not be said with human lips. And so what they would do would be, when they got to that point in the text, remember, you have somebody that was reading the dictation. They would read the manuscript and everybody else is transcribing it. When they got to that point of saying Yahweh, they would either mouth the word like that, or they would just say Adonai, which means Lord. And then that was your cue to put YHWH. You couldn't say it, but you could write it. And so that's how they talked about that. So when we talk about this transcribing the divine names, that was a place where everybody stopped and you made sure that Yahweh was transcribed properly. Jack, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, what about when God said that I am, or you also have like Jehovah?
Okay,
which also means God, right?
That's a good question. Jehovah is a German translation of Yahweh. And the reason for that is in the Hebrew language, there are no J's. Okay, and there's no V's in Hebrew. So Jesus, you don't say Jesus, you'd say Yeshua. Or
right.
You'd say Yeshua, which is Joshua, Yeshua. And so Yahweh. Germans at the same time they don't have Y's or W's. Their W's are pronounced as V's, Volkswagen. That's the point of that. So Jehovah is just a German, what do I want to say, transliteration of Yahweh. So that's why I say Yahweh, I don't say Jehovah.
What about I am?
Yahweh.
Same thing. Huh?
Yeah. Yep. Okay. So talking further about the Masoretes and their care, they measured, again, I noticed they measured their everything, their margins on their papers or their letters or their parchments were all precise. They stored everything precisely. Everything was meticulous. They had very specific rules in inscribing and copying and preserving the documents that they would compile. And so notice also as we continue to look at these transmission standards, that a little bit ahead of myself, they were forbidden from copying scripture without a vorlage. A vorlage just simply means the manuscript that's being copied. They had to have one of those in front of them. So not only did they have somebody dictating it, but they had to have one in front of them as well. And so it was quite a detailed process with this. And you could see the information from Paul Wegner, who's a professor at Gateway Seminary now in Ontario. He mentions also the fact that the Jewish writers would, they mentioned the fact that the temple had correctors. And you see the word correctors there, megahim, who would look at the scrolls, they would proof text it one more time. So, I mean, they had ongoing editors, proof texters to make sure at this point. So, moving on, next blank that we're filling in at some point during the Talmudic period, and that is from 100 BC to 400 AD. These rules were put in place. So somewhere in here, that's where the scribes that we've talked about put these rules in place. And here were some of those. Again, parchment made from clean animals, using only black ink, lining the page before adding the letters, adding a set column width and word spacing, space of a hair between each consonant, the space of a consonant between each word. Every scribe had to be freshly bathed. They had to be in full Jewish dress before beginning to copy the scroll. They couldn't get up in their pajamas with a cup of coffee and sit down in front of the table and start writing. They had to get dressed up. They had to take this seriously. And so they had to be alert. They had to be in their places with bright, shiny faces. And so and you could see the quote that Wagner had in his article. These scribes made meticulous notes regarding the text, from recording the number of letters used in a book to indicating the middle letter of a book. That's how meticulous this got. They made careful notations along the sides of the Hebrew text in multiple other volumes concerning the reading and pointing of these texts. So they made careful study notes in the margins. Later, an entire treatise was created to guide scribes in the proper procedure for preparing a sacred scroll and producing an accurate text. So once these scribes moved off the stage, the next generation of scribes would be ready and they would follow the same rules. And then the next generation and the next generation, and so on and so on. So you see, there's quite a bit of precaution that was taken over the course of the centuries to preserve it. How did they do? Well, that's what was up for debate 150 years ago. This was one of the things that was brought into question. We can't know this for sure, because we don't know what mistakes were made in this period. But you can see right now, boy, these guys were serious in making sure that what they copied was accurate, and they went to great pains to ensure that. So we'll go on. Looking at my time, we've got about 15 minutes here, but look at the different materials, the different equipment. So we talk about those, the different equipment that was used by the scribes. The pens, the ink, the inks were usually compounds of charcoal, gum, or water. So they would blend all this together and they would come up with their ink. The pens were fashioned from reeds and they were fashioned from quills. So a reed from a river was sharpened, dipped in ink, and it was ready to be used. Same thing with a quill. They didn't have paper in the sense that we have paper, you know, that was made from wood pulp or things like that. So they had to use papyrus, which was water reeds. They had to use parchment, which was made from animal skins. They would use broken pottery, and they would use wooden tablets. So they would take their writing instrument, the reed and the quill, dip it in the ink, which was made of charcoal, gum, and water, and then they would write on the papyrus, they would write on the parchment, they would write on the broken pottery or the wooden tablets, whatever resource they had to write on. So that's essentially how this was transcribed. Those were the process. Okay, now, in addition to these two Masoretic texts, the Aleppo Codex and the Leningrad Codex that we know, there's other evidence that comes alongside. One of them is called the Samaritan Pentateuch. Now, when you see that word Pentateuch, do you see a word in there that kind of stands out? The word Pentateuch?
5. Penta?
5, yep. And it's 5 books. Want to guess as to what 5 books of the Old Testament those are? Books of the law, the Torah. You see, the Samaritans understood and they recognized only one part of the Hebrew Old Testament, and that was the Torah, the Pentateuch. That was all they had. That was all the scripture that they had. And so when Jesus met the Samaritan woman at the well, that was her point of reference. You know, so they rejected the rest of the Hebrew Old Testament. So they rejected David, they rejected his writings, they rejected the prophets. And so when the woman said to Jesus, you Jews say Jerusalem is where we're supposed to worship, we say Mount Gerizim, right over here. We're to worship on this mountain. And that's when Jesus came and said, you know, there's a day that's going to be coming where it doesn't matter where you worship because you're going to worship in spirit and truth. Okay, so she was referring to this Pentateuch, this Samaritan Pentateuch. That's all she had. So that's evidence. But again, it supports what the first 5 books of the Bible are. So you've got that extra evidence. Another document called the Nash Papyrus it goes like this. It was before the discoveries at Qumran, and Dave alluded to this. We're going to get there in just a moment. The Nash Papyrus was the earliest textual witness to the Hebrew Bible. Nash Papyrus. It was purchased from an Egyptian dealer in 1902 by Dr. Walter Nash. And it dates back to the 2nd and 1st century BC. The Nash Papyrus contains the 10 Commandments. It contains part of the Exodus and part of the book of Deuteronomy. And so right now, that Nash Papyrus is housed at the University of Cambridge in Great Britain. Another piece of evidence here, Samaritan Pentateuch, the Nash Papyrus, is another one called the Silver Amulets. Silver Amulets. And this was discovered by an archaeologist from Israel called Gabriel Barkai. Barkai discovered 2 tiny silver amulets in a family burial chamber in 1979. And he was excavating there in the Hinnom Valley. They unrolled these amulets, these documents, and discovered that these were ancient. They studied them. And these amulets were small enough that they were worn around the neck or the wrist. Remember, if you've studied, the Pharisees in the day used to wear phylacteries on their foreheads. Everybody, you all heard of phylacteries? You know, the Pharisees wanted to show you how spiritual they were. So they take Deuteronomy 6, where Moses says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, all your strength. You shall bind them on your forehead." Okay, so they used to take scripture. They used to take that shema, that word, that passage, put it on a little strip of paper or a little document, a little piece of leather, and they would put it in a box. They would put a strap on the box, and they would strap the box around their forehead. So see, I'm binding it around my forehead. It's not what he meant, but still. So amulets were something very similar to that. They most likely would have been worn around the neck or the wrist, and they were very covered very densely in Hebrew manuscript. And so you read that manuscript, and as they read it, they started to see that these were from the period around 586, right before Jerusalem was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. So that's a little bit earlier. That's interesting. So you have these silver amulets, and they were described by this professor at New York University like this: the priestly blessing played a major role in Jewish worship in the temple and synagogue. Its text, inscribed in the ancient Hebrew script, was found in an amulet from 7th to 6th century BC at Ketef Hinnom in Jerusalem. This inscription is the earliest attestation, say that 5 times, of a text from the Torah. Some scholars have argued that this amulet proves that the blessing pre-existed the book of Numbers. In our view, the use of this passage as an amulet indicates that it was already known in its present context. So you have these three documents that add to and support the Masoretic text. Now we come to the moneymaker, and that is the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the Dead Sea Scrolls answer the question rather conclusively. And they were discovered in a fascinating way. 1947, there's an ancient site called Qumran down in the desert. Little shepherd, Bedouin shepherd boy, was bored. He decided he was going to start throwing rocks around, and he wanted to see if he could throw a rock in a cave. He made it into a cave, and he heard something break. He went up to the cave and looked, and he saw that he broke a pot. He broke a clay pot. And as he looked in the pot, he saw that there was a document. He went and told his dad. His dad came out. He saw that this was something that was important. Went back, got the rest of the village. They came out and saw that not only was there one pot, but there were all sorts of pots in there, and they all contained all sorts of different manuscripts, much of which was written by the prophet Isaiah. And so they went through by, and you could see, there were some 11 caves that they discovered that had these documents there. Over 1,000 scrolls written in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. The earliest scroll that was found there dated back to 250 BC. And so as they continued to see these scrolls and date them, they were copied shortly before Qumran was destroyed by the Romans in AD 68. And so they totaled out, there were some 300 biblical scrolls in those manuscripts, 300 of them. And so what they were able to find that as they looked at that and compared it to what we had in the Masoretic text, they matched within 99.4% of each other. They were identical. And
Wow.
so these were dated, notice, some 200 BC. And so that's, instead of a 1,500-year difference between Malachi and the Masoretic text, you have now 200 years. And now you're on level turf with any other ancient document. They're all within that. And so, most scholars don't have any problem with the reliability of other ancient manuscripts that are within 200 years of its original writing. And so that just adds to the validity of the Old Testament. It's a fantastic story how you see all of this being preserved for some 1,500 years. And now we can look at what we have today, and you can almost see the miracle, can't you? That God incredibly preserved that incredible document that all points to Jesus. So, any thoughts on that? Questions on that? Anything doesn't make sense?
I'm just thinking about where it says that all scripture is written for, what was it? Inspiration and correction. How does that go, Pastor?
2
You know what I'm
Timothy
talking about?
3:16. 2 Timothy 3:16, all
For
scripture is
reproof,
inspired by
for
God.
correction.
For instruction, for rebuke, for correction and training in righteousness.
Right, right.
Mm-hmm. So it's quite an incredible book that we have, the Old Testament.
That was quite a study, but I couldn't write as fast as you were talking.
Well, again, that's a lot of ground to cover. That's why we recorded it. You can go on and watch this later on YouTube, and you can pick this up. And the slides that I have later tonight or tomorrow morning, I'll go ahead and convert those and put those up onto the website, and you can access them there.
Oh, great.
So, and again, I'll send this in an email. I'll send the file, the slides file, so you can just have it in your inbox if you want. So you trying to get it to where you've got all sorts of access to it. I'll even send you a link to the YouTube video first part of this week, so you guys can have this, because it's important that you've got the confidence that what you have in front of you is not something that's made up. It's not make-believe. It's an incredible story, and if you know the story, you see God's incredible hand in preserving it and making it available to us. And all too often, I think we take it for granted. It's first world. Oh, I've got a Bible. Well, I've got 10 Bibles, and we look at different places in the world. They're not allowed to have this book. Why not? And it's because it's that powerful a book that changes lives. So, any other final thoughts, reflections, questions?
It's amazing what you did there. It took a lot of work to put all this together.
Yeah. Don't hesitate as you look through this. Questions come up, shoot them my way. Text me, email me, something like that. Be happy to do what I can to get you extra information. As you look, one of the things I think that you need to remember is a great source for this is Josh McDowell and Sean McDowell's book called Evidence That Demands a Verdict.
Right.
You want good detailed information. You really want to get in the weeds. That's the book to get. You'll have all sorts of great stuff there.